Without further ado,
Okay,
would you
cool.
share?
Hello, everyone. Yes, Acts as historical fiction. Let's see. Okay, mine is much slower than yours, so I can remember that. Okay. So to begin with, it's important to have some sort of bibliography if you want to do further reading on this. This is for the literary analysis of Acts. These are the best 3 books to start with if you're a beginner on this. The Mystery of Acts, and these are all relatively short books too. The Mystery of Acts by Richard Purvo. Does the New Testament imitate Homer? 4 cases from the Acts of the Apostles by Dennis MacDonald. And The Power of Parable, how fiction by Jesus became fiction about Jesus by John Dominic Crossan. Now, Crossan's book does the Gospels as well as Acts, so it's actually a really good introduction to how all the Gospels and Acts are works of fiction serving particular literary purpose. And he's a relatively famous biblical scholar, as in fact are all these guys. Dennis MacDonald is well known. Richard Purvo is the world's leading expert on Acts. So these are the best books to start with. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today comes from these books, so this is like the principal bibliography for this. Now I've researched it in academic journals and lots of other aspects of it too, but these are the best ones to start with. So just to get you oriented here, there are basically the 3 synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. After them, John came along. I'm not going to talk about John, but I'm going to talk about the others because they relate to Acts. Now, Luke, Acts were written by the same guy, and they're kind of intended to be read together. They go together. And in a sense, Luke, Acts is a response to Matthew. So both Luke and Acts together are designed to be a response to Matthew, and Matthew designed his gospel to be a response to Mark. Now, what's going on with this? The Gospel of Mark is the first of these to be written. And the basic thinking of Mark is he's trying to create a gospel to promote the idea that was first innovated by Paul, St. Paul as the Christians now call him, that you don't have to convert to Judaism to be a Christian. Now, the original Christians were a Jewish sect. If you wanted to join Christianity, you had to become a Jew. And in the book of Exodus, there's a procedure for that. So Judaism, being a Jew wasn't a racial thing. It was something that you could actually symbolically become through circumcision and following the covenant laws. Mark wrote his gospel to have a Jesus promoting the idea that you didn't have to do that you could just be a Christian. Now, Matthew didn't like that, so Matthew rewrote Mark and added a bunch of stuff that was stuff that's more Jewish than Mark, and he has his Jesus promoting the idea that no, you still have to follow all the Torah laws, you still have to be a Jew, circumcised and the whole thing, until the end of the world when you get completely new bodies, and then you won't need to do that stuff. But in the meantime, that's the objective of Matthew. Now, Luke came along. He was unhappy with Matthew's treatment of this. So Luke, he didn't like the little infighting between Matthew's group and Mark's group. The Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians are non-Jewish Christians. Luke wrote his thing saying, can't we all just get along? So a lot of his, both the Gospel and Acts especially, is designed specifically to promote the idea that the church had always been unified, that the Jewish Christians and the non-Jewish Christians could get along, and that they didn't have to have this infighting. But the subtext secretly is you don't really have to be a Jew. So Luke and Acts is still selling the idea that Mark was selling to begin with, that Christians don't have to be Jewish. But he's also selling it in a way that's trying to unify the 2 churches, the 2 different sects at the time. So that gives you sort of the background of what the objectives are. Now when you notice that, what I said there, I said Luke is responding to Matthew. That's kind of a growing view in the field, but the mainstream consensus, the widest consensus, is against that. It's the idea that Luke did not know about Matthew. That's changing in the field as more and more scholars are coming around to the idea that that's not the case. And in fact, Luke did know Matthew, and in fact, Luke is writing his book specifically as a response to Matthew. And one of the examples is the Nativity. Luke's Nativity is written specifically to be a reversal of and a rewrite of Matthew's Nativity. Luke did not like Matthew's Nativity, so he rewrote it. And so he's consciously doing this. So Luke knows Matthew. And this is the view that goes against this particular theory, the alternative theory, which is that Luke didn't know Matthew, and where Luke and Matthew agree, and they agree a lot, sometimes verbatim, often verbatim, that Luke and Matthew were using another document, which is called Quella, for German for source, or just a Q document. That's the alternative hypothesis. But if you want to look into that, these are the 3 books to read because, in my opinion, I've done a lot of research on this. There's no argument for Q. Q should not have ever been a thesis accepted in the community. I'm adamantly convinced that it is a non-viable hypothesis. And that seems like a radical thing to say, but if once you read books like these, you'll see that there really isn't a case for Q. Luke is just copying Matthew. And the books to read against that are for that are The Case Against Q by Mark Goodacre, New Light on Luke, Its Purpose, Sources, and Literary Context by Barbara Shellard, and Michael Goulder's book, Luke, A New Paradigm. These are like the good introductory text to like get an idea of what the Q theory is and why these scholars think it's false. I'm meeting more and more scholars who are agreeing with them as time goes on. Now, so that's the background, so you have it sort of you're oriented into what we're talking about. What I'm going to be challenging here specifically today is this notion, which you still somehow run across. Even secular historians say absurd things like this. This is Maurice Casey, a direct quote. Luke was an outstanding historian. That's not even remotely correct. In my book, Not the Impossible Faith, I have a whole chapter, well, the first half of chapter 7 of this shows why that's not the case. I'm going to give you a lot of examples that aren't in that chapter as to why that is. But the advantage of Not the Impossible Faith is it orients you into the literature in terms of what actually was an outstanding historian by the standards of that time. So if you're interested in reading about that and looking into the literature on that, that's the place to start, because I have the bibliography there. But today I'm going to look just at Acts itself. It's not an outstanding historian. He's not even a good historian. In fact, I don't even think he was honestly trying to be a historian. One of the things that he does differently than other what we would call outstanding historians in the ancient world, and there were several, what he doesn't do that they do are things like this. He never identifies himself or his qualifications. This was something that ancient historians typically did, is they said who they were, and they said why you should be listening to what they're saying. Like, this is why I know what I'm talking about, I was there, or I talked to these people, or I'm a big important person, or whatever. They usually identify who they are and why they're qualified to write a history. And even if it's not in the preface, it's somewhere in their book. That was commonly the case, and was the case for all what we consider the outstanding historians of the ancient world. Luke never does this. Conspicuously never does this. He never names or evaluates his sources. This is something that's very peculiar and very conspicuously odd about Luke, as if you're going to try and treat it like a history. The most outstanding historians of the ancient world did this. They either named or they evaluated their sources. They would describe where they learned the information that they're imparting to. One of the most outstanding examples is Arrian. Arrian wrote a history of Alexander the Great 500 years after the fact, but he only used 3 sources, and they were all eyewitness sources. They were books written by people who traveled with Alexander. He names these sources, he identifies the books that he's using as sources, he explains the relative merits and demerits, and he tells you how he's going to use them. This is how an outstanding historian by ancient standards would behave. Luke never does this. He never names his sources, he never explains why they're good or which ones are better than others. He gives you no orientation into that. Luke also never reveals his methodology. This is another thing that we find very commonly in the most outstanding historians of antiquity. Throughout their book, they would often explain how they're coming up with their stories, their version of events. They explain their methodology, they criticize other historians, and so on. I give an example in Not the Impossible Faith using Suetonius. Now, anybody who's in classics knows that Suetonius is notorious as a really, basically a gossip monger. He's like not even considered an outstanding historian, and even he does this. So that gives you an idea of where Acts falls on the totem pole of reliability. And anyway, I give you an example of Suetonius doing this in chapter 7 of Not the Impossible Faith. So then we get to the preface, and this is usually where Christian apologists or even secular historians will attempt to say that Luke is a good historian because he has a preface that looks like the preface to a history of the time. The thing is, we know this preface is fake. He's faking the preface to sort of make it look like a history, but he's not really doing it. And the reason we know he's not really doing it is because the preface lacks everything that should be there, that we would find in other prefaces. Even other historians, they might not put this stuff in their preface, but if they didn't put it in their preface, it's put somewhere else in the book. At least the ones that we consider outstanding historians. So what we're looking at, the preface of Luke, and the preface of Luke can be considered a preface to Acts, because Acts is kind of like chapter 2 of the gospel for him. Makes it look like a history book, but it omits key things that a real preface would contain, like these things I just said. So oftentimes when you look at these prefaces that are supposed to be typical prefaces for outstanding ancient histories of the time, they have these things in them. These are the things that are conspicuously absent in Luke's preface. And that's suspicious. Finally, his preface espouses a really lousy method. Basically, ultimately, and I show this by analyzing the Greek and explaining and putting it in context in chapter 7 of Not the Impossible Faith. What he says is basically, ultimately, I just slavishly followed previous Gospels. He says, I'm reporting this stuff as accurately and precisely as possible, meaning he's not doing it critically, he's just taking tradition and trying to repeat it exactly. That's what he says is his method, which is a really, really terrible method. That's like the worst method that you can use if you're going to be considered an outstanding historian. That's not outstanding history writing. The irony is that he's lying. He doesn't do that at all. In fact, we know, for example, that he used Mark as a source. I'm quite certain he used Matthew as a source. When we look at his actual sources and what he did with them, copying them slavishly and exactly is absolutely not what he did. He changed everything. And he did it deliberately and sometimes egregiously. So he doesn't even follow the method that he claims that he's going to use in his preface. And finally, when we look at historical fiction generally throughout the world and throughout history, when you write historical fiction, you use reference books, right? You want to get the background facts right. So there's someone who did I think his name's Colin Hemmer, wrote a book trying to defend the accuracy of Acts, trying to make Acts sound like it was an outstanding history. A book reviewer in an academic journal pointed out in the book that so one of the things that Hemmer says is, well, he's got all these background facts correct, so that makes him an outstanding historian. And this reviewer said, well, you know, this reviewer has read numerous detective fiction novels in which every single background fact and all the details of police procedure are 100% accurate, and yet it's completely bogus. It's entirely fiction, it's not history. When you're writing historical fiction, obviously you're going to try and get background facts accurate. If you're really good at doing fiction, you'll do that. And you could do that in antiquity by using reference books. One of the ones that we are pretty sure Luke used is Josephus, and that's the first thing I'm going to talk about when I get through comparing him to another aspect of this. Now that's comparing Acts to outstanding historians of the time. He doesn't compare well at all. It looks suspicious already. Now let's compare Acts with another genre of literature at the time called the novel. There are a lot of ancient novels, complete fiction, written at the time. We have several of them. And let's not look at what their features that are shared with Luke and Acts in particular. All of these, Acts as well as all those other ancient novels, they all promote a particular god or religion. They're actually religious novels. They're not just random entertainment romance fiction. They're actual religious narratives promoting a particular god or religion. All of them are travel narratives. Acts conspicuously is a travel narrative. All of them involve miraculous or amazing events. That's pretty clearly the case in Acts, and I'll show some examples as we go on. All of them include encounters with fabulous or exotic peoples. This is one of their features. You travel around and you meet these unusual people. Acts has lots of this. They meet Lycaonians, Maltans, Athenians, Ephesians, and they're like colorful stories about the strange things going on in these places and the behavior of these people. All feature chaste couples separated and reunited. Acts has a small nod to this with the story of Paul and Lydia. It's like a little mini version of this that we find in all the other novels. All of them feature exciting captivities and escapes. And in Acts, by the way, there are 2 prison breaks, 2 military rescues, and a shipwreck. Classic novel. And they also include excited crowds. There are always excited crowds that become like a character in the story. And we see this in Acts, Ephesus, and Jerusalem, and so on. So these features, which are typical of ancient novels, are typical of Acts and seen in Acts as well. Divine revelations are always integral to the plot in all of these novels, also in Acts. And these novels often include themes of persecution and divine rescue, where the God is involved in rescuing people. Acts does as well. So when we look at Acts and compare it to ancient fiction, it lines up perfectly. It doesn't line up perfectly with histories. And then we also know that Luke is lying. We can prove this because we have, for example, Paul wrote these letters. We have some of his letters where he tells us himself what happened. And Luke, when he wrote Acts, changed it all because he didn't like the actual story. It didn't work for his narrative, the goals he had. Paul himself tells us that he was still unknown by face in Judea for years after converting. After he was converted by Jesus, he immediately went off to another place. He was converted outside Judea. He went somewhere else for years before even coming to Judea. So he never was in Judea, never met anyone in Judea. No one knew him there. Acts has Paul start in Judea. He knows everybody in Judea. He immediately goes back to Judea, or almost immediately goes back to Judea after converting. So already we know Acts is telling a lie. This is not what happened. Luke is telling a different story. He wants to change history. It's revisionist history. Paul says he went to Arabia after converting and actually spent possibly several years there. He didn't go directly to Damascus as Acts. Acts has him go immediately to Damascus and then back to Jerusalem. He doesn't spend any time in Arabia. So Acts has changed history and deleted an entire key part of Paul's background. Paul also tells us very clearly that he innovated the Torah-free gospel and only reached an uneasy détente with Peter, who was the main leader of the original sect. It wasn't the case, as Acts shows it, where Peter gets a vision to already think of this idea of a Torah-free gospel, and he and Paul are promoting it from the beginning. They're both in sync. They both agree on this concept right from the beginning. This is fiction. Acts is rewriting history. In reality, Paul and Peter's wing of the church were at odds with each other. They kind of had an uneasy agreement. They did not see eye to eye on this, and certainly Peter never had a vision that convinced him that Paul was telling the truth, that this is the new way to go. And you can find the truth in Galatians, where Paul tells his version of the story. And then, of course, just to give you another example, the main character, Jesus, he flies off into outer space in Act 1. I mean, that doesn't happen in real history. So that's already right there, like first chapter, you know this is not history you're looking at. This is mythology or fiction. So we'll read this quote by Burton MACK, who's a well-known biblical scholar. Luke says that the standard sermon was preached to the Jews on the day of Pentecost. That was the first day the Christians went public with the gospel. And often thereafter, whereupon hundreds converted, and the world became the church's parish overnight. But this is a story that does not make sense as history by any standard. No Jew worth his salt would have converted when being told that he was guilty of killing the Messiah. No Greek would have been persuaded by the dismal logic of the argumentation of the sermons. The scene would not have made sense as history to anyone during the first century with first-hand knowledge of Christians, Jews, and the date of the temple in Jerusalem. So what do we have on our hands here? An imaginary reconstruction in the interest of aggrandizing an amalgam view of Christianity early in the 2nd century. Luke did this by painting over the messy history of conflictual movements throughout the 1st century, as I was mentioning before, and in his own time. He cleverly depicted Peter and Paul as preachers of an identical gospel. That is myth-making in the genre of epic. There is not the slightest reason to take it seriously as history. I concur. Some of the features that Burton MACK points out that I've noted as well in my work. In Acts, when when Peter and the other first Christians start trying to convert hundreds of Jews in the middle of Jerusalem, they're quoting the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the sacred scriptures, including the mistakes, because the Septuagint gets the Hebrew wrong in places, or changes the valence of the meaning of the words, because the Greek has different meanings than the Hebrew. So they're making arguments based on the Greek translation that wouldn't be makeable from the Hebrew original. You're in the middle of Jerusalem, and you're converting hundreds of Jews using the Greek translation of their scriptures in their own native language. That's not reality. That would never happen in history. You would be using the Hebrew scriptures. That's the only way you could possibly convince Hebrew-speaking Jews in Jerusalem. And you would certainly be making arguments based on the Hebrew and the Hebrew text, not arguments based on the Greek translation, which was more popular, more generally used outside Palestine. You see in scenes repeatedly of instant conversions without argument. There's no debate, there's no period of, oh, I don't know. There's no kind of acts of convincing. They say, you know, you've killed the Messiah, now repent. And they go down on their knees and says, yes, we repent, we're converted. That doesn't happen in reality. You don't convert hundreds of Jews in one day with a single speech. Go to Israel now and go try that and see, experimentally if that would actually match how things actually happen. Clearly it's not. These are mythical, fictional narratives. We get in Acts miraculous escapes from jail, twice, actually. I'm going to talk more about that. That's an example of many things that happen in Acts that are not history. These are the exact kind of things you would see in fiction. They're not things that you would see happening in the real world, generally. And also the idea that no one cares about an escaped convict. Now I want you to think about this for a minute, the way Acts and the whole narrative goes. What the Christians are doing. Now Pontius Pilate has just executed Jesus, and the Christians are going around not only claiming that Jesus is still alive, that he got out of the tomb, he's still alive, but he's still giving them orders. He's still walking around he was, hung out with them in Acts for like almost a month, still giving them instructions and stuff, and they're still going around trying to spread, trying to create followers for Jesus. What would that look like to the Romans? It would look like someone escaped their execution, who they killed for insurrection or trying to claim to be king. He's still alive, he's still at large, he's still giving instructions to his followers, and they're still trying around to actually spread his movement. What would happen here in reality, the Romans would engage a massive manhunt for this. They would be hauling all the Christians in, waterboarding them or whatever the hell, to try and ask them, where the hell is this Jesus? How did he escape? Where is he? That would be the number one thing that the Romans would be engaged in. And yet when you look at the narrative of Acts, the Romans don't care. When the Christians are hauled into court, the Romans say, I don't see anything wrong here, you can just let them go. They're completely uninterested in this idea that there's an escaped convict or anything. So that's contrary to reality. So Acts is not describing the way things actually happened. This is a fictional narrative. This is the way that Luke wants history to have been rather than the way it actually would have been. Now there's an alternative explanation for that, by the way. You can also explain that by suggesting that Jesus never actually existed as a historical person, and Acts actually has an underlying true account that is actually distorting. But I'll leave that for my next book to tell you about. But your alternative is Acts is completely full of it. Now there's an article by Stephen Law in which he defends, this is a philosopher, he defends the principle of contamination. This is the idea that if you have a book that's full of a lot of ridiculous claims, then those ridiculous claims contaminate the remaining mundane claims of the text, so that you can't even believe the mundane claims because you're already very suspicious of this source in general. And he's not only defended this logically, he's also defended it against Christian apologists like William Lane Craig. I wrote an article on my blog, which you can Google, if you want to see the argument and how Christian apologists are trying to tackle it badly. My article is Craig versus Law on the argument from contamination. Stephen Law's point is that when you see all these markers of fiction in a book like Acts, you should conclude the whole book is fiction. You really can't trust anything in it is historically authentic. So what we're looking at, we've got lies, plus improbabilities, plus missing reliability markers, markers of ancient fiction. The book is done. That's how we would conclude if this were a book in any other religious tradition. So we should treat Acts the same way as we would treat the same book from Muslims, from Mormons, from anybody else. So I mentioned Josephus. It looks like Luke used other histories to crib color and background material for his story. So he does get a lot of background facts right. He also gets a lot wrong, but he gets a lot right. We can prove this is likely in the case of Josephus because we actually have the writings of Josephus so we can compare them. I suspect because Acts has a narrative that goes from Palestine and then up into the Aegean, then he gets a lot of facts and details and color background for the Aegean. I suspect there was a history of the Aegean that he was using, some historian who wrote about the history of the Aegean of that period. That history is now lost. I believe there was one that Luke was using for color detail in that region, but in Palestine, we know he was using Josephus at least, possibly others as well. Steve Mason is one of the historians specializing in Josephus who has noted this, and he wrote, almost every incident of Judean history that Luke mentions turns up somewhere in Josephus's narratives. And the coincidence of aims, themes, and vocabulary seems to suggest that Luke in Acts is building its case on the foundation of Josephus's defense of Judaism. And I'll give you some examples of that. Especially, by the way, the Jewish antiquities. We can directly link Luke's use of materials to, clearly, I'm pretty sure he was using the Jewish antiquities as a source. We know the Jewish antiquities was written in 93 AD, so we know Acts was written after 93 AD. And that's the conclusion many scholars have reached. So here's some examples of what I'm talking about. The census of Quirinius, that's all written about in Josephus. Luke rushes to include it in his story, and he actually has to completely change the nativity story to make it fit. He has to actually change the year that Jesus was born in order to fit this piece in from Josephus and give this sort of color detail in the background. I talk about that in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, which is one of the books that I do have copies of to sell tonight, where we actually know that this is what's going on, and that Luke, and that the date in Luke is 10 years later than the date that would be the case in Matthew, for example. So he had to change history, changing the year of Christ's birth by 10 years just to fit this detail in. He includes the death of Herod Agrippa I, which is also in Josephus, including the peculiar detail of wearing a fabulous robe. So it looks like he's cribbing info and changing it up. They're both associating Agrippa II with Berenice, and in telling ways. So the way Luke in Acts associates these two sounds like he was assuming the reader knew, stories that were in Josephus about them. He did the same thing by associating Felix with Drusilla. The mention of an obscure tetrarch, Lysanias, also in Josephus. So he's getting color detail like that from Josephus. The mention of the famine in the reign of Claudius. That's a detail he's cribbing from Josephus and throwing into his story, trying to incorporate into his narrative. He adds details from Josephus' account of the siege of Jerusalem. When you look at Luke's account where Jesus is predicting the destruction of Jerusalem, he copies from Matthew and Mark. He adds details. What are the details added? They're details that we know from Josephus. He repeats Josephus' penchant for calling the Pharisees the most precise school. That's an idiom that looks like it comes from Josephus, from his own particular proclivities and interest in the sect. Luke borrows it. So that's kind of a tell. He refers to Pilate's slaughter of the Samaritans during a religious ceremony, which also comes from Josephus, but key thing, Luke gets it wrong. He makes a mistake. He confuses the Samaritan slaughter with the slaughter of Galileans. And he says that Pilate slayed these Galileans during the religious sacrifices. There are no religious sacrifices in Galilee that could have been the case. But there were for the Samaritans, and we have the whole story in Josephus. So he's made a mistake. Luke has got the wrong group. Instead of Samaritans, he said Galileans. Why? Possibly because Josephus says the slaughter occurred on the mountain of Gerizim, which in Greek looks similar to Galilee. I've written the Greek down here. Gerizim and Galilee are the root words for both of those. That's what he would be looking at. It's an easy mistake to make. We have lots of mistakes like this in scribal writing of the time. So he probably just quickly skimmed the text, saw Gerizim, what his eyes saw was Galilee, and he said the Galileans. So we can explain it, the mistake that he made, by understanding that he's using Josephus as a source. But we have better examples for that. Luke, curiously, includes the same rebels that Josephus talks about, Judas the Galilean, Theudas, and the Egyptian. There's no particular reason for Luke to have included these guys, but there is a particular reason for Josephus to have done so. So it looks like Luke is cribbing Josephus for this color detail. Luke gets the chronological order of Judas and Theudas out of order, like hugely. But the order that he puts them in is the same order that Josephus mentions them in one particular passage. So in other words, Josephus talks about Theudas and then he talks about Judas the Galilean, even though in reality Judas the Galilean, his events were decades before Theudas. So Luke transposes the chronology by mistaking the order in which they were talked about in Josephus. This is a mistake that can only be explained by Luke cribbing from Josephus and badly. Also, incidentally, Theudas, his story, actually, he rose and started his movement decades after Luke's story. So Luke has someone talking about Theudas decades before Theudas had even become a thing. So that's a clear tell that we're looking at fiction, not history. The idea of Josephus liked to call rebels by their nationality. He refers to someone as the Samaritan rather than giving them a name. He refers to someone as the Egyptian. He doesn't mention their name. That seems to be a peculiarity of Josephus, so it's weird for Luke to also talk about the Egyptian instead of using his name. Luke also confuses the followers of the Egyptian with the Sicarii, the knifers, yet Josephus mentions those two groups in the same place. So once again, Josephus is talking about the Egyptian and then the Sicarii. Luke has just sort of conflated them together and said the Sicarii were working with the Egyptian. It's a mistake that only makes sense if you're cribbing from Josephus and being very loose about it. Also, the idea of calling the knifers, the assassins, the Sicarii, which is a Latin word, appears to be an innovation of Josephus. So for Luke to use the exact same word is another tell. Also, Luke confuses the Egyptian with other religious figures that Josephus mentions, again in the same place, as leading people into the desert. So Josephus talks about the Egyptian, then he talks about these other religious figures who led people into the desert. Luke talks about the Egyptian leading people into the desert. So he's taking all this section of Josephus and compressing it to create his own sort of fictional version of history, which only, again, makes sense for him to unite all of these features in one place when they're only seen together in Josephus. It would only be known that way. So it looks like Josephus is Luke's source, and Luke's not even trying to be very accurate in his use of Josephus. So what we see here, as you've seen several examples, Luke gets the facts wrong in ways that tell he is writing fiction. I mentioned a few examples as we go along. When he does get background facts right, it's because he didn't err every time he used a reference book. I mean, anybody can use a reference book and get facts right that way when you're writing fiction. But none of the facts that he gets right can be independently connected with the history of Christianity. It looks like Luke is the first one to try and unite the history of Christianity with these facts from a history like Josephus. So that's emulating history. Now also Luke, in writing Acts, emulates fiction. Now I mentioned there were 2 prison breaks, and there are miraculous escapes in both cases. He borrows the idea from Euripides, this fictional mythical story, the Bacchae. In Euripides' Bacchae, there's a miraculous unlocking of chains, and then later there's an escape due to an earthquake. Guess what? In Acts, he has a miraculous unlocking of chains, people escape from prison, and an escape due to an earthquake, people escape from prison. That's an odd coincidence, don't you think? So he's getting ideas from fiction as well. Dennis MacDonald has explored many aspects of this. When Paul gets shipwrecked in Acts, when Luke tells the story, he basically borrows the story when Odysseus gets shipwrecked and just writes Paul in, adds some Jewish details, and makes some changes to the story the way he wanted to. So they're both shipwrecked with the same nautical images and vocabulary. That's one of the tells. There's an appearance of a divine being assuring safety in both stories. And by the way, divine beings don't appear to people in reality, so that's another sign of fiction. They both talk about riding planks on the sea, so that particular peculiar detail is shared between them. The hero in both stories lands on an island and meets hospitable strangers. The hero is then mistaken for a god, which is a peculiar detail that's in both stories. And the hero is then sent on in a new ship. So the ideas here, these structural concepts, and as well as the vocabulary and certain other aspects, Luke is cribbing from fiction already. So he's writing history using fiction. Now we have some history related to this. In 1 Corinthians 11:25, Paul mentions that he was shipwrecked 3 times and was at least once of those occasions, adrift for a day and a night. But that's all he says. So it looks like Luke read this little line from Paul, decided to write in one of those shipwrecks, and created a whole shipwreck narrative out of this one line that Paul says in his letters. We have lots of examples in ancient fiction of this being the case, where you take one line from a work of fiction and then write up someone's biography based on that one line. We have a lot of examples. Mary Lefkowitz is one of the leading experts on ancient biography who's shown that this is done a lot in ancient biography, so it's not even an unusual fictional tactic in the ancient world. Dennis MacDonald also shows that Acts doesn't just rely on the Odyssey, it also borrows detail from the Book of Jonah and the Aeneid as well. So there are many aspects of this where Luke is just cribbing details and coming up with ideas for writing his fiction. Dennis MacDonald mentions many. I'm not going to go into these details, I'll just mention them. You can look in his books, the one book I recommended earlier for these. Paul's resurrection of Eutychus is based on Odysseus' fate of Elpenor. Visions of Peter and Cornelius are based on the Iliad's Agamemnon, story of Agamemnon. Paul's farewell at Miletus is based on Hector's farewell to Andromache. The lottery of Matthias is based on details of the lottery of Ajax. Peter's escape from prison borrows ideas from Priam's escape from Achilles. And so all of those things that we're seeing there, Dennis MacDonald analyzes and shows how literary concepts and the ideas, where Luke is getting the idea of the story, the structure of it, and building out from there. But most importantly, Luke uses scripture as inspiration, and here's an example of that. Peter's vision, the key components of that are also based on Ezekiel. And what we see here is this. In both of these accounts, both of these guys, Ezekiel and Peter, both see the heavens open. Both are commanded to eat something in their vision. Both twice respond to God with the exact same phrase, "By no means, Lord. Me damos Kyrie." Kyrie. Both are asked to eat unclean food, meaning spiritually unclean food. Both protest that they have never done that before. And so you have all these elements that are clearly a lot. He's basically getting the idea from Ezekiel's visions and building Peter's vision out of it. And then from that vision, he later has Peter defend Paul's gospel. Peter defending Paul's gospel. In reality, Paul was defending his gospel to Peter in history that we know from Paul. Instead, he practically takes Paul's entire speech, his entire defense of his view to Peter, and puts it in the mouth of Peter. So he actually has Peter now advocating based on this vision, which convinced Peter even before Paul tried to convince him of it. So Luke has invented a vision that explains why Peter was on board with Paul's new innovation all from the beginning, and then has Paul's defenses of it put in the mouth of Peter. That's fictionalization. That's historical revisionism. That's not what actually happened. Another aspect of this is that to sell his idea that Peter and Paul were in harmony and selling the same views of the church and were equally authoritative in the church, Luke creates a historical narrative that parallels them. So Peter and Paul he shows that they're kind of the same dudes with the same powers and everything. So each one gets to raise someone from the dead, peculiarly. Each one gets to heal a paralytic to show that they have that same ability. Each one heals by a magical extension of themselves. Shadows in one case, handkerchiefs in the other. So it's a peculiar detail. He's showing parallels that their power extends even from them through objects. Each one gets a story based on that. So he's showing how they're similar. Each defeats a sorcerer. I mean, 2 sorcerers in one historical account. That's impressive. And each one defeats a separate sorcerer, which is also suspicious. Each miraculously escapes from prison. Remember I mentioned there are 2 escapes from prison, one for Paul, one for Peter. See, they each get to do this. Peter is summoned by Cornelius in a vision to save him. Paul is summoned by Macedonians in a vision to save them. So they each get this sort of vision where someone from history calls them to come save them. So again, Peter and Paul are being compared. But also, Luke wants to sell the idea that Paul is extending the ministry of Christ, so he compares Paul and Christ as well. Both walk the earth and preaching, ending at Jerusalem. So they go on this long walking journey that ends in Jerusalem. Both of them get to do this. Both are arrested over a disturbance in the temple. Both are acquitted by both a Herod and a Roman prefect, coincidentally. Both are plotted against by the Jews, yet are innocent. So Paul and Christ are basically being paralleled here. Gets better. Both are interrogated and beaten by the priests and the Sanhedrin together, which is an unusual detail. Both know that their death is foreordained and prophesy tribulations in the church to come after them. So they both get to do the same thing. Both die and rise from the dead. You probably didn't know that Paul gets to die and rise from the dead in Acts. It's there, Acts 14. So both of them get to rise from the dead. Both are hailed to God, incidentally, curiously. In addition to all of that, Paul does things bigger than Jesus. And Luke goes out of his way to make it look like this. Paul travels a much wider area around a much larger sea. It's not the Sea of Galilee anymore. It's the frickin' Mediterranean, right? So much bigger sea, much bigger walking area, much bigger preaching ground. Paul faces greater peril from a storm at sea. Paul's ship actually gets wrecked and he has to survive on his wits on the sea, whereas Jesus gets to calm the storm and prevent the ship from sinking. So Paul faces more peril, but he also faces the same kind of concept of a storm at sea. Paul's trial, when he finally gets tried, spans years rather than a single night. So even a bigger trial, he gets even a bigger trial than Jesus. Whole armies plot to assassinate Paul, and then whole armies come to rescue Paul. Nobody did that for Jesus. Jesus stirs violence in one synagogue, Paul in 2. So he outdoes Jesus even there. Paul wins new followers after his resurrection. That's something Jesus didn't do. Paul gets up from the dead, walks right back into town and starts preaching again. Notice that's something conspicuously that didn't happen for Jesus. And also, unlike Jesus, Paul got to deliver his gospel all the way to Rome, the heart of the entire Roman Empire. Something Jesus didn't get to do. So Paul gets to do things bigger than Jesus. Of course, he's inspired by the Spirit of Jesus, so it's really Jesus behind him the whole way. But that's the whole message that he's saying here, that Christianity is growing through the agency of Paul. That's fiction. Another example of where Luke borrows stories from himself is the EMMAUS narrative. And then the EMMAUS narrative is where these 2 disciples or 3 disciples are going, or 2 disciples are going to Emmaus from Jerusalem, and they meet this guy on the road, and this guy explains to them the scriptures, and this is after Jesus has died, and they were all despondent and thought, that they were doomed and so forth. But this stranger tells them, no, Jesus had to rise from the dead and so on, and you should believe in all of this. And then they finally realize that the stranger is Jesus, and then he mysteriously vanishes. That's the Emmaus narrative in short. Paul's conversion narrative is a rewrite of Luke's Emmaus narrative. Both occur on a road from Jerusalem to another city, Damascus in the case for Paul. Both feature a revelation of Christ in different forms. Both do this, both they have this revelation as they draw near a city where they are going. Use the exact same words in Greek. So the exact same concept is they draw near the city where they are going, they have a revelation of Jesus, where they encounter Jesus. In both stories, Jesus rebukes the unbeliever for their unbelief and instructs them in how they should believe. They are converted by this and go and preach what they are learning. So both stories end the same way. And in both tales, the chief priests are conspicuously named as the enemies of the church. So those are the parallels there. There are even more. It gets better. Both stories peculiarly feature a literal blindness that is then lifted. So that's one of the most key parallels between them. The Emmaus vision has God explain why Jesus had to suffer. That's the key part of the Emmaus narrative. The Damascus vision has Jesus explain why Paul had to suffer. So remember, Paul and Christ are being compared in Luke's version of history. The Emmaus visitation occurs on the third day, at which blindness is lifted. The Damascus visitation causes 3 days of blindness. So we have a reversal here. At Emmaus, the blindness ends after a meal commences, and again, at Damascus, a meal commences after the blindness ends. So we're seeing parallels and reversals to compare Paul with Christ. So his entire vision narrative is based on the Emmaus narrative, which Luke made up to begin with. I won't go into why we know that. But he writes fiction, and then he copies his own fiction. Basically borrows his own story models to tell it again and again, and he does it on purpose, to compare Paul with Jesus. He uses this story again, uses this model again, when he tells the story of Philip and the Ethiopian. In this case, Philip stumbles across an Ethiopian who's reading scripture, and he says, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And he basically converts him to Christ by explaining the scriptures that the Ethiopian is reading. It's also based on the Emmaus narrative. Also, again, on a road from Jerusalem. Also mentions an ignorance of scripture, both stories do this, and has an interpreter, the interpreter, resolve that ignorance. That's a key component of the story. Both center around a key question. In the Emmaus narrative, the question is, what are you discussing, which starts the whole exposition. In the Ethiopian narrative, it's, do you understand what you are reading? That starts the whole exposition. Both include a request for the interpreter to stay longer. So in both stories, the guy who's being convinced, or people are being convinced, ask the interpreter to stay with them longer. So that's another key detail. Both feature a sacrament. This is another important detail. In the Emmaus narrative, Jesus enacts a Eucharist. That's the whole scene that's being created in the Emmaus narrative. In the Ethiopian narrative, Philip enacts a baptism. That's the central sacrament of the Christian church that is being done there. So he's basically copying the story twice to sell two different sacraments, and therefore have a complete gospel. Both feature an apostolic opening. The concept of something opening appears in both stories. Cleopas' eyes in one story, in the Emmaus narrative, Philip's mouth in the other. So that God opens their eyes or their mouth in each case. Both feature, and this is the most significant deal, both feature the miraculous vanishing of the interpreter in the middle of the sacrament they are performing, as if to highlight the fact that the sacrament is the key element of the story. So in the Emmaus narrative, Jesus enacts the Eucharist, and in the middle of it vanishes. In the Ethiopian narrative, Philip starts the baptism and then vanishes, right? Which is fiction. That doesn't happen in the real world. People don't just magically disappear. But the fact that it happens in both stories tells you that Luke is using the same story model to create this fiction. We also get in Paul's vision, Paul gets his own John the Baptist. You know, John the Baptist baptizes Jesus. Well, John also baptizes, a sort of John, also baptizes Paul. This is because the guy who baptizes Paul is Ananias. John and Ananias mean the same thing. They're the same word, actually. John in Hebrew is Yahu-Hanan. Yahweh is gracious. Ananias is just Hanan Yahu. Gracious is Yahweh. So it's the reversal of John's name, and when you convert it to Greek letters, is Ananias. So John and Ananias are basically their own palindrome. John says in the Gospel, for people to prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Guess what? Paul meets Ananias on Straight Street, literally. The name of the street is Straight Street. That's fiction. Come on. And that happens after Paul tries to destroy the way, the exact same word, then seeing the Lord on the way, the exact same word, which convinces him to preach the way that he sought to destroy. So here we have John's narrative, the John the Baptist narrative, being mapped onto Paul and showing and explaining how Paul is converted by the same process and then is allowed to enhance and spread the gospel. This is fiction. These are the techniques that ancient authors were taught to write fiction. Also, there are other parallels, like God speaks to Paul in a vision from heaven, then Paul prays and is baptized, and then Paul preaches the gospel. In the Jesus version, Jesus is baptized, then prays, then God speaks to him in a vision from heaven, then Jesus preaches the gospel. So we have the order is exactly reversed, which is a technique, a literary technique of story construction that was also taught in ancient schools. So I would remind you again, all the stuff that I've covered, you might try to explain away any particular one of them, but when you see so many of these, and some of them are just, you can't explain away anyway, but when you see so many of them, you kind of get the impression of what's really going on here. You kind of get an idea of this is the way Luke writes, this is the way Luke composes stories. So Stephen Law's concept of contamination has to apply. When you see so much literary artistry, rather than attention to actual historical research and writing, you have to conclude the whole thing is like this. This is the way Luke writes. So when you look at the story, you might not be able to figure out where his inspirations are or what he's trying to do with the story. You have more than enough reason to believe that he's doing it using the same techniques he used on the other passages. So when we get to Acts as a fake history, the conclusion here, we look at all of the things I've surveyed. It lacks key markers of being a real history. It has all the markers of being a fictional novel, as I pointed out. It lies about historical facts, which I've demonstrated. It makes key mistakes about historical facts, which I showed several examples. The narratives are historically implausible, and gave several examples of that. And Luke invents stories according to literary needs. He needs to accomplish something, he needs to communicate some concept about the gospel, some sort of thing that he wants to say to the church. History is irrelevant. And yet he's going to go against history, he doesn't care about history, he's going to tell the story he needs to tell to communicate the ideals that he wants to communicate. And he copies other fake stories, even his own fake stories. So when you add all these things up, the conclusion you have to reach is that Acts is fiction. It's fiction being sold as fact. It's revisionist history. He's trying to rewrite history to sell a particular ideal, to sort of counteract the Matthew versus Mark battle. He's trying to say that these churches have been united since forever, can't we all get along, we don't have to really be Jews, get over it, and this is the way Christ wants things to be, and you can see this as Christ enacted his gospel through Paul and Peter. That's the message he wants to communicate, and he's writing fiction to communicate it. That's it. So that's basically a summary of several details that I talk about in Chapter 9 on the historicity of Jesus, which should be out in a few months. There's more of it in there as well. So that's the presentation. I will take questions now.
You have a question back?
John.
Just so the audience doesn't misunderstand you.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You're not saying that Paul didn't go on missionary journeys. You're just saying because we can see that from his.
Well, we know. Well, presumably we know Paul did those kinds of things because Paul tells them himself. Right? We have the eyewitness, his own account of what he did. Now we lack a lot of information about what Paul did, and we have to accept the fact that we probably don't know 99% of what actually went on. But we can reconstruct some of it from Paul's letters. We don't need to look at that. So, yes?
I thought the presentation was this is going to prove Jesus does not exist.
Oh, no. Well, no, that's not the point of today. Today is to show that you can't use the book of Acts to argue that Jesus existed because the book of Acts is fiction. So we're throwing out a piece of evidence for that.
So that's the thing.
Yeah.
The book of Acts is fiction.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Yes.
What is your opinion on using Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to try to piece together the history of Jesus because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels, so we can try to compare the histories there. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, Matthew is just rewriting Mark. He wasn't happy with Mark, so he wrote his own version of Mark. And we know the things he added, most of them are either obviously bogus or clearly invented by Matthew. So Matthew also is not writing history. He's trying to write a better gospel. He's not interested in what actually happened. He's interested in what he can convince you of what happened, right?
Okay,
and Luke is then trying to do the same thing to Matthew. So the Synoptic Gospels are just basically rewrites of the same gospel. They're all just basically the Gospel of Mark. Each author is trying to change it up the way he wants.
Okay.
So we don't really have corroboration there. What we're looking at is an evolving, embellishing. We're looking at a myth that's sort of growing over time. People are just adding to it.
What do you think of Tacitus and Josephus' accounts of Jesus existing?
Right. For the people who might not know what she's referring to, there's historians, Josephus, who I mentioned, in his Antiquities, which was written in 93 AD, there in the manuscripts that we have today, he mentions Christ in two passages. One is obviously an interpolation where Christians just squeezed a paragraph in that he didn't write that. The other is less clear that that's the case. But my book, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, has my peer-reviewed academic paper on this that I published with, I can't remember which journal, but one of the biblical studies journals, where I show that both of those passages, in fact, are Christian interpolations. They were never written in there by Josephus. So in fact, Josephus never mentioned Jesus. That was something that Christians added to the manuscripts of Josephus hundreds of years later. Tacitus, I suspect, also the same, and I also have my peer-reviewed academic paper in that book as well on Tacitus, which was published by, or will be published by, Vigiliae Christianae this year. Again, an example of peer-reviewed scholarship on this, showing that we have good evidence to suggest that the mention of Christ in Tacitus was also added by Christians sometime after the 4th century AD, or the middle of the 4th century AD. But even if that weren't the case, Tacitus wrote around 116 AD, where we know the Gospels were already circulating. So Tacitus could, if he really wrote that passage, all he says is that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate. He could have learned that from the Gospels, and there wasn't any reason to suspect that he would bother fact-checking that, because he already found that fact intrinsically embarrassing. He didn't need to research it to confirm it. So even if Tacitus did write that passage, it doesn't corroborate the Gospels. All it does is repeat the Gospels, essentially. So it's not usable to defend the historicity of Jesus. Other questions behind? Yes, back there.
I'm currently reading Goodacre's book, Q.
The case against
Q.
Yeah.
I'm probably only 75 pages into it, and he's made a statement that I see so many other scholars making, and I don't know if it's defensible. But he's saying that Mark is writing oral tradition. What's your opinion of oral tradition? Did it exist in the time of Mark? And is it defensible that it is oral tradition?
Defensible in the sense that it's possible. I mean, it's not implausible, right? Certainly we know lots of stuff traveled around as oral tradition. And there had to be oral traditions, for example, about the sayings of Jesus. Even if Jesus didn't exist, we know from Paul that they were receiving visions from Jesus in which he was giving them commandments and instructions. So there would be, or that would be orally transmitted for a while. So even there would be oral transmission of the teachings of Jesus that were learned through revelations. So even if Jesus didn't exist, there would be an oral tradition to write from. So the question is, are the details that place Jesus in history part of an oral tradition? Firstly. Secondly, does that oral tradition go back to an actual fact, or is it something that somebody made up at some point? Those are questions that are much more difficult to answer. And someone like Goodacre, when he wrote that book, certainly wasn't, and he's still not. I mean, he and I talk about this a lot, and we'll see if he changes his opinion on this in the future, but he certainly doesn't think Jesus didn't exist. He believes there was a Jesus, but he agrees the Gospels are a fiction about Jesus, right? In the same way that John Crossan says. So he thinks there might be some oral tradition behind them. He might agree that we might not have access to a lot of it. We might not be able to tell which things in the Gospels are true or not. And that's a common view among historians in the field right now. The idea that Jesus didn't exist is there's only like maybe 6 or 7 of us who have PhDs in the field who are convinced of this so far, or are agnostic about it. That might change in the future as my book comes out, we'll see, because it's going to be the first time where the case has been made in terms that the academic field can sink their teeth into.
Yeah.
So we'll see if that changes anything. But when Goodacre was writing that, certainly he believed Jesus existed, and that's what he's saying, is that probably there's some oral tradition behind this.
Yeah, but my point is, if Paul's writing as late as 60, and he's been in ministry for 15 years,
Yeah.
Paul does virtually no oral tradition whatsoever. So within a decade after Paul, we've got all sorts of oral tradition.
That's a conspicuous problem. Yes.
You know,
I
and
concur.
for a scholar to cite that it's oral tradition,
Yeah.
I think is, you know.
I agree. It's bizarre. It's also bizarre. But yeah, just in general, the fact that all of these traditions suddenly appear after Paul's dead, right? And Paul doesn't seem to be aware of them. There are lots of examples, of many scholars have pointed out, where sayings that are put in the mouth of Jesus in the Gospels are actually things that Paul said, and not that he said that Jesus said, just things that Paul himself said, that they then make Jesus say, right? So they can use Jesus as a kind of historical puppet that they can make him say whatever they want, and therefore confer authority on those words. Because when Paul said it, it's just some dude, but when Jesus says it, it's God, right? So now you have to listen. So that's one of the ways that sayings for Jesus got fabricated out of that. Any other questions?
Are you pretty much in agreement with Bart Ehrman that not all of the Pauline letters are by Paul?
Yeah, that is, I mean, I'd say probably 95% of the scholars, certainly if you exclude fundamentalists, who obviously are biblical literalists and can never admit that, even if it were true, 95% or more scholars agree only 7 of the Pauline epistles are authentic, the others are forgeries. And like I said, that's pretty much the mainstream view, everybody agrees. So yeah. Somebody new? Anybody new want to speak? Yes.
So just doing like a cursory Google search on your name brings up a whole plethora of different people writing up various responses to your writings. And one of them that I saw that I thought had a slightly interesting question is they brought up the point, it's just like, oh, we looked like Irenaeus and people like the 2nd century, all the other official people in the church leading on from there. They said like this whole notion of like the myth of like Jesus and I guess from extension Acts really didn't occur with any of the heresies within that time. Like they bring up points like, oh, there's heresies that go on questioning is like the God, Jesus was man or if he's God and so on. But this whole notion of myth is like a newer type thing. What would be your response to something like that?
The way I would respond to it would depend on the exact wording of the particular person you're quoting, because that matters. Because it depends on what they mean by these things. Certainly when Irenaeus is writing in his Against All Heresies, he's referring to and describing groups that believe that Jesus was born and died and resurrected in outer space, that he wasn't a historical person, and the historical person was an allegory for the cosmic person, which is the myth theory, full stop. And so Irenaeus doesn't quite understand this, so he kind of just assumes that these are historicists that he's talking about. But when you look at what he's describing, it's clear that he's talking about the whole idea that the mythicists are talking about, which is that Jesus started as a cosmic being that people knew through revelations, and that the historical gospels are, the historicizing gospels are euhemerizations, which is a word meaning that they've taken a cosmic God and put him in history and made a whole narrative around him, which is fiction. That's the thesis that I think is the most defensible thesis. And so Irenaeus is already attesting to the fact that those groups existed. Key is that we don't have the writings of any of those groups, so we don't know what they themselves were saying. And one of the key examples of that is the letter of 2 Peter, which we have in the New Testament canon, which is a forgery. It was written not even by the same author who wrote 1 Peter, so most scholars think 1 Peter is a forgery as well. But even if 1 Peter is authentic, 2 Peter was written by somebody else because their authorial style is so different. 2 Peter actually says that he's arguing against fellow Christians. He says there are these Christians who say that the gospel stories are contrived myths, that they're made up. And he's saying, no, they're not. I actually met Jesus on during the Transfiguration, and then he borrows a story from the Gospels. And this is the forgery. This is Peter himself saying this is someone else pretending to be Peter saying this. So this 2 Peter is a letter written specifically to attack some group of Christians who were saying that the historical Jesus was a myth. So we have, and that's fairly early. That's like early 2nd century probably. Possibly earlier than that. We can't really know for sure. But so the idea that it's a new idea that came later isn't the case. What we would want to see is what's going on in the church in the first century, between like 30 AD and 95 AD. Like, who was saying what in that period? We don't know. All we have are the Gospels, which we know are making stuff up. We have the letters of Paul, but they don't make a clear distinction, and they stop in, before the 60s. And then it's just there's basically a 30 to 50 year dark age in the church where we don't have any idea who was in charge, what doctrines they were fighting, what heresies were going around. We have no documents from that period that talk about what was happening in the church at the time. And those are the documents we most desperately need to resolve what was actually happening, how the mythicism to historicity thing changed. And because we don't have access to that information, we can't talk about what it didn't say. And so that's a common reality in ancient history. It's frustrating, but that's the reality we have to deal with. So I'll let someone new before I start taking repeats. Yeah.
So I have to admit I haven't yet read the New Testament, even though I grew up in church. I started reading the Bible in December, and I've only gotten up to Job.
Sure.
Which was
wow.
really
Okay.
a wall.
Well, you got through the hardest parts, all the begats.
Different concepts of hardness there. But I recently attended a presentation by a Christian professor / apologist a couple weeks ago, and it was on the morality of the Old Testament. And I went because I was very interested, and I feel like the Old Testament is very barbaric and scary.
Yeah.
But his argument is that when, for instance, the Bible says God telling the Israelites, I'm going to kill all these people for you, clear them out of the land for you, or the Israelites go in and kill all the men, women, children, and animals of this or that town. He says that's really just rhetorical flourish. It's not like really historical, because the Bible does say these people still exist. A few pages later, there they are.
So when the Bible has God commanding them to do these things, that's made up. God never said that.
He says that it fits with the whole genre of the time. That's what was in these stories.
Right.
And yet the hang up for me is that, like, why is God's holy word using these rhetorical flourishes, saying that he's going to kill all of these people or something like that? And I hadn't really thought of it in this concept of contamination, but if there's all of these rhetorical flourishes that God apparently needs for his story, can we really take that narrative of what these people are doing at that time as this history at all?
Yeah, exactly. If it's all rhetorical flourishes, then you don't know what's fact or fiction. And it makes the book kind of useless if you want to try and figure out what the fact is. Yeah, I agree.
And he went to great lengths to try to say that slavery wasn't really slavery. And
sure. I know some of the apologetic arguments on that. Yeah.
He's co-authored some books with William Lane Craig, so I
do you know his name?
Paul Copan.
Yeah, Paul Copan. Yeah, we have a refutation of his argument on that from Hector Avalos, who's a major biblical scholar. John and I, in one of our anthologies. Which one is that in the slavery? Is that Christian Delusion? When Avalos takes on Copan?
It's one that comes in October. I wrote it.
No, but I mean the one where he takes on Copan's argument. For the first one. Is it Delusion or?
Biblical.
I think it was in Delusion. Christian Delusion.
His own book.
Yeah, no, it isn't Avalos. Avalos has a chapter in the Christian Delusion. I think it's Christian Delusion.
Oh, it is, yeah. Yahweh is a moral monster.
Yeah, Yahweh is a moral monster, yes.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Where he defends that proposition against Copan. And so it's in there, and then, so you can see one biblical scholar arguing against another.
It was on his book, Is God a Moral Monster?
Sure, yeah. Okay, so John.
Yeah, I have a question. Is it good enough just to point out the facts as you did so well? Do you also have to propose, or have you conjectured how such a work of fiction was accepted in the church, or do you have to do that, or is this your case entirely? I mean, it's a good case. I'm just saying, how do you think that got accepted by the church?
Well, one could ask that question of the entirety of Christian literature. I mean, when you go outside the canon, you look at the ridiculous things, the stories that they were telling and where people were believing in and buying into. Clearly, the prior probability is extremely high that they bought anything, as long as it agreed with the particular ideology that they wanted to sell.
Especially when he's trying to harmonize the Paul.
There's because Acts, by the way, the Book of Acts is the canonical Book of Acts. There's like 6 or 7 other books of Acts that didn't make it into the Bible that Christians also wrote and are spreading around. They're also just as ridiculous. I think the Acts of John is one of my favorite because it has him commanding bed bugs to stop biting him, and they miraculously leave bed and go into the corner and sit there all night dutifully. And to prove, I mean, from my point of view, that St. John was a douche, After he was leaving the inn, he commanded them to go back into the damn bed. Like, clearly didn't give a shit about the next guy. Anyway, that's ridiculous stories. Easily bought by lots of people. So, but we also don't have any documentation regarding the reception of Acts because no one talks about Acts in the 2nd century, almost not at all. There's like, maybe towards the end of the 2nd century, you have some references, but no one talks about who was reading it or what they thought about it. So we don't really have the impression of how its reception occurred over decades of time, which we would love to have, like to have some sort of thing. We got those sorts of things from Mormonism, for example. We have lots of documentation about how the stories that were invented were received over time and how they changed over time and how reception changed over time. We don't have that documentation. It existed, it just didn't survive the test of time. Yes?
So getting back to your thesis though, is that nothing miraculous can happen.
Well,
If something happened to one person, it cannot possibly have happened to another person.
it's not a question of cannot possibly, it's a
And
question
the
of
other-
probability.
I'm going to say the third, and the third thing is that if person A does something, but they don't talk about it. If person B talks about it, person B is lying.
I'm not sure I understand the second.
Well, you mentioned the fact that Luke said something about Paul being on the boat or something, shipwrecked, and you said, well, but Paul never said anything about it.
Oh,
So
yeah,
so
no, you
therefore
notice
Luke
there was the
must-
other side of that. Is
So
I
therefore
actually showed,
Luke must be lying.
yeah, no, that in itself wouldn't be enough. The fact that it copies the story of Odysseus, and the fact that it borrows ideas from Jonah and the Aeneid.
Well, but again, so if something happened to one person, it couldn't possibly have happened to anybody else.
Well, you're focused on this couldn't possibly. It's not a question of what's possible or impossible. It's a
Well,
question of what's
you
probable.
said it. You
No,
said it.
it's a question of what's probable. So
Right.
if you look at any book like the Quran or the Book of Mormon, for example, you look at any other treatise, when you look at and you see these silly stories, you wouldn't believe them. So there isn't any particular reason to treat Acts differently than any of these other stories when they use the exact same devices to fictionalize their accounts. So I mean, you could, in desperation, say you're agnostic. Well, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. We're not sure because of the way Luke composes his stories. Makes it impossible for us to know if he's doing it historically or not. The fact that we have the examples that he's lying about lots of stuff, that he's not following the markers or the traditions of actual reliable historical research and criticism, all of these things. The fact that he's matching up, from top to bottom with all the attributes of ancient novels. You add all these things together, you have a general trend of looking at, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at something more like the Book of Mormon, where Joseph Smith basically just made this stuff up and sold it as a particular scripture. That's what Luke is doing. Now, it's certainly logically possible that everything in Acts is true, but when you look at the grand scope of history, if you saw this book from any other religious tradition, you wouldn't buy it. And so if that's how you would treat other religions, that's how you have to treat Christianity. The documents have the exact same chance of being true or false as any other documents that have the same attributes and features. Yeah.
Okay, on your reliance on base theorem and probability, so if you yourself were to witness something as a very small probability naturalistically, would you doubt your senses or would you believe it?
It would depend on what it was. I talk about examples of this, like the things that would convert me to Christianity, in my book, Why I'm Not a Christian. It's a short 90-page book, so if you're interested in that, what it would take to convince me. I mean, in terms of Bayesian terms, it would have to be a confluence of things that is less probable than all the other explanations that are available. So for example, is it less probable that, or for example, if it's more probable that I'm dropping acid, if it's more probable that I'm dropping acid, then I have to conclude that that's probably what's happening, unless I can find evidence that would be very improbable otherwise, right? So any kind of experiential thing that would convince me of a particular religion, Christianity, Taoism, for example, I was a convinced Taoist. That's the only religion I actually had faith in my actual background, which I talk about the sense of goodness without God. I was convinced by religious experiences that actually convinced me that Taoism was true. Over time, I read enough in science and realized that the prior probability was much higher that I was hallucinating, and that I was having hallucinations based on sleep deprivation and other phenomena. So if visions like that were to convince me again, they have to have features to them or be conjoined with other events. It would be so improbable if I was hallucinating that the only likely explanation is that I was really experiencing these things. And there are ways for that to happen. I can imagine them, I've talked about them. In both those books, by the way, Sense of Goodness and Why I'm Not a Christian, I give examples of things that would convince me if they were actually going on. Any other questions? We have one back there again, yes.
This is just point of interest, but you mentioned Luke's use of the road to Emmaus story in the Philip conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch. I believe I got this from Robert Eisenman. If you look, Luke has taken that story from Josephus, where Queen Helen comes with funds for the famine relief of Judea. I don't know if you were aware of that, but that story has a lot of parallels.
Yeah, I'm less convinced of that because I know the actual backstory to how Luke created the Emmaus narrative, which I didn't talk about today because I'm talking about Acts. So much more is explained by that than having to resort to Josephus. However, I am completely convinced that Luke is using Josephus as a source for ideas, so that he would get crypt details that way is entirely plausible because he's done that a lot.
Well, some of the details are amazing if you look at the story.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not. In my experience with Eisenman, when I check his facts, they don't usually line up quite the way that he claims.
Well, I read the
so-
Josephus. I read the Josephus paragraph,
Yeah.
and
I'm just saying I'm initially skeptical of that. I would need to research that to check before I
but
would buy into
if
it.
you
But
read that
it's
paragraph,
plausible.
there's a lot of parallels.
Yeah,
there.
it's definitely plausible. I'll give you that. Yeah. Any other questions? I think okay. So we're gonna go eat or drink.